Uh, I probably need to click OK there, don't I? Yes, I have. That is a very kind and lovely introduction, and all I can say is I hope I live up to part of that. So much appreciated. However, I have to say, as I was talking to the guys before, I really look forward to this type of session. And as Lisa mentioned, I've been involved in mainstream, and I keep coming back to mainstream because I know a couple of things. People who are part of the mainstream community have jobs where these issues are really important to them. And you're here because you choose to be, and I do appreciate that. We've got a nice small group as well, which I appreciate, and I'd love to encourage people to get involved. So I'm quite happy for people to put their hands up at any time as we go through the next 90 minutes. And I know your questions are not only going to be relevant, but they will most likely stimulate some good conversation around the group. So please do that. If you feel more comfortable using the chat, that's fine as well. I'll try and keep an eye on that and respond to chat-related comments and points as best I can. On the other hand, if you want to sit and eat your wonderful lunch in peace while you're listening, feel free to do that as well. I've got to say that, don't I? That's probably good for your mental health and well-being. All right, let's get into it. I'm going to share my screen at different times, but I will also pull that down when we're having conversations. So if you want to come on and be on camera as we go, feel free. All of those things are your choice. So let me just pull up the presentation and make sure that that is functional. Micah, I can see you. Does that come up okay? Excellent. All right. We're here to talk about implementing, but it's not just implementing. I would like to make sure we get a chance today to talk about designing, developing, and considering what it is might be in a contemporary and effective mental health strategy. And let me be absolutely clear. This is a curly, dynamic question. And there are many things that I'm going to share with you today that, I've had a crack at. I've been part of many projects to try and develop mental health strategy. We don't always get all of it right. But I think having really good conversations about the things that work and some of the things that perhaps are less optimal is a really useful thing to do. Can I also, as we do, and on behalf of, I'm here today, as you can see, on behalf of the Assure business, which I'm connected with, and I'm part of the board of the mental health side of Assure. And can I, on behalf of everybody here, acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands and the waters of the countries that you are all on, and you're a very diverse group on many lands. I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people here in Melbourne, and I'd like to pay respect to elders past, present, and emerging, and in particular to those of you on the call today who might be of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander background, a particular welcome to you, but also a similarly particular welcome to everyone who's given up the time to come and participate today. All right. I think it's really important to set some parameters around what we're going to talk about today. 90 minutes seems like a long time. I suspect it'll fly, particularly when we get into the conversations. But there's a few things I want to try as best I can to get to in the course of our conversation. I hope that what people will take away is as much as they need to, because I don't want to assume many of you may well have well-developed strategies and you're here to maybe add to those. But at a baseline, I think helping people to get a clearer understanding of what are our corporate, our organisational obligations, but how to take our strategies beyond simply compliance. And I'm going to talk a bit about what the compliance side of this all looks like, not to scare us, not to deter us, because I do find at the moment there's a fair bit of discussion around some of those obligations. Many of you will know that there's been recent let me call them upgrades in some of the regulators and what they expect and hope for when it comes to mental health strategy. And I'd like to reference some of those and talk about what they really mean on a day-to-day basis out there in our worlds of work. Hopefully, I like to be as practical as I can. Like many of you, I'm a leader, a manager. I've run a couple of organisations, and in those roles, wrestled with many of the things we're going to talk about today. Right, this is sometimes not as clear cut as the other things that we do in our day-to-day jobs. So I think I want to acknowledge that some of the discussion will take us to places where we may not all necessarily 100% agree, and that is completely okay. The third thing is, however, to really make sure that we're dropping into the discussion at the right times. What does evidence actually look like? Someone had put a question to me the other day, which I thought was a really sensible question. And they said, well, hang on, Simon, what is evidence? Is my experience evidence? And the answer to that is yes, it is. And we need to think about evidence on a continuum from, a properly refereed, published journal article all the way to people's legitimate experience. And evidence is not a simple, singular thing, as many of you would know from your own scientific, technical, and engineering backgrounds. Nonetheless, I think putting the evidence lens over what we're going to talk about today is quite helpful, because I will also share, in the safety of this room, my occasional experience where I see things put in place that are sadly fads, short-term trends, things that really don't have much substance or basis behind them. And I'll tell you one thing that you already all know. Sometimes those fads can be really expensive, both in terms of the spend to get them up, but then in, unfortunately, some of the costs that flow from them when we don't get these issues right. So we'll talk about evidence. And we'll also talk about, ultimately, the real point of this is to help how we think about developing a really effective, contemporary mental health strategy that has a chance of working in your environment. Now, just before I jump into this slide, I'm going to do what someone said to me a while ago. It was a really good piece of advice. And they knew me well, and they knew that sometimes I don't get to all of the agenda items because I love a good discussion and I love getting people involved. So if anyone is taking notes, and I'm not advocating, but some of you might be, I'm going to tell you the 10 things right now that I want to make sure we get to. And essentially, these will be the sort of 10 headlines of today's discussion in terms of the things that I think are really important when you're considering developing a good mental health strategy. So here they are. Quickly, and don't worry, I'll be going back and revisiting each of these, but as a starting point, here's the 10. Number one, a really important starting point is to understand the uniqueness of your operating environment and its intersection with the broader social context within which we are operating. I'm going to explain a fair bit more about this as we go, but that will take us to discussions about what's going on out there, right? What is it that we're facing up to in terms of mental health in the broader community, and how does that then impact our workplace? Number two, and this is one that I've learned the hard way at a very personal level. And point number two is this: get as clear as you can about the organisation's position and vision when it comes to mental health strategy. Now, that might sound Captain Obvious, but on the other hand, I've seen many mental health strategies that try to be all things to all people. And that is a recipe for cost and failure. The third point is that the best strategies I've seen are ultimately built collaboratively. Now, I am well aware, and we will have a conversation about this today, that the concept of consultation and collaboration in building a mental health strategy has all sorts of logistical issues. Who do you get involved? Why do some people get involved? And I'm going to offer some suggestions about consultation framework. And it's worked reasonably well for me, and it's something that I've evolved with some of my colleagues over many years to try to be as practical and efficient when it comes to collaboration. The fourth point is a very simple one. Less is more. Do fewer things in your strategy so that you can do them well. The pride I've seen in some places when I've been shown a mental health strategy and it's got about 100 initiatives on it. And as you'll all see, this is not a session to be judgmental or critical, because good on them for having a crack. But I'm not sure how you do a shopping list of 100 things and do them in a way that people are going to engage and get value from them. So my point is, a good strategy will be about less is more, but let's do a few things that matter and do them well. The next point is a practical one. The good strategy in the mental health space is going to have at least three components to it. And in plain language, they are the preventative side of it, the on-the-ground management of issues around mental health, and the third component will always be how we respond. So if you're thinking about a good strategy that has the prevent, manage, and respond elements to it, that will serve you, I think, potentially very well. Whoever's counting will know which point I'm up to. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Point 6. Thank you, whoever said that. Point 6. Every mental health strategy needs a comms plan sitting next to it. I actually was doing a workshop recently online, and the people in the audience who are part of a group at Australia Post that I was working with were in a remote location, and we got to the point in the conversation where I said, who's aware of the Employee Assistance Program? And there was a room full of 20 people, and on my camera I could see into the room that they were sitting in. No one put their hand up, which had me scratching my head. However, I could see at the back of the room was an A4 poster on their wall with a picture of the Employee Assistance Program and the 1300 number. And it was just a reminder for me that a comms plan will inevitably be more than sticking a poster up with an initiative or a phone number on it. This is a really important, and at times it's complicated, but I've got a few thoughts about how we can really have a success story when it comes to the comms side of it. The next point we're going to spend a bit of time on today, and the point is that a good and effective mental health strategy will inevitably ensure that you own and mitigate your particular and actual business risks, in brackets, in the mental health space. Not all businesses have the same risk profile. Now, this is a change in language, as we'll see when we talk about it, but I think it's a really helpful and effective one. And in essence, you know what we're doing? We're bringing good old-fashioned safety practice into the world of mental health. And personally, I think that's not only appropriate, but it's effective. It's not the whole story, but as a starting point and as a dotted line into compliance and what the regulator will expect from us in our organisations, focusing on your particular and relevant risks is a really useful thing to do and important. The next point will be, I've seen many mental health strategies and I looked at them and I thought, I wonder whether we have the leaders and the supervisors who feel confident and capable to execute this strategy. And I think we ask a lot of our wonderful line supervisors and managers, and I think we have to be extremely careful and practical and supportive to help make sure they feel that they have the knowledge, the capability, and the confidence to help execute the strategy. And I have to say, and I guarantee if I could see all your heads now, I can see a few, you'd all be nodding, thinking, we do. We ask a lot of supervisors. Our strategies in mental health will say things like, yeah, the supervisor should notice things, or the supervisor should be aware of all of the options that are available to people. I'm not going to make the mistake of underestimating how important that is, and ipso facto, then how much we need to support the capability and confidence in that piece. The second last point is about, and this will apply probably to many people in this call, and it certainly applies to me. And again, this is one I've learned through my own errors and failures, as well as hopefully the odd success. The role of senior leaders in unfailingly leading by example on the things that are in the strategy is absolutely critical. And I do understand that to some extent that can be a burden. However, we all know, don't we, that if we see or experience or hear our senior leaders and feel that they are not aligned to or supportive, or perhaps inadvertently work practices that are not aligned to what we ask of our people, then that is going to be an issue. The last one, I hope, is not controversial. And again, I feel like hopefully I'm in a good space here to have this, because I can tell you that this last point is part of a daily conversation that I have, not only in my own workplaces, but when I'm out and about with leadership teams. And that is the importance of your mental health strategy, avoiding fads and irrelevant political interests. And I'll talk more about that as I go, and being really clear about what are the things that are going to give us longevity, that are going to have substance, that are going to have evidence, and that enable us to actually make a difference in our workplace is really important. All right, there they are. They're the 10 things. Can I pause there and let me just pull the slide down for 1 second, because I'm going to just ask for a comment. There you go. I can see people again. Just give me a thumbs up or a thumbs down. Do those 10 things sound relevant and as a starting point in terms of a framework? Has anyone got a quick comment about any of those? Is that Maya Lisa Walther there? Oh, good. Lots of thumbs up. Thank you.
It is indeed.
Oh, that's nice. I've got a few people I know in the room, which is wonderful.
I'm off camera because I'm scoffing some lunch, and I didn't think you'd. I didn't want you to get food envy.
Yeah, there's a few people out there having a wonderful lunch. Thank you for those thumbs up. But let me be clear. I'm happy, and it's really important that if people have different views, we do listen and express them. One of the things I'd add into this as a broader overlay is that the mental health discussion is a place for compassion and listening. And I sometimes do get dismayed when it feels like it turns into a battle. And I think when we're starting to talk about good collaboration and consultation, setting those things up so that people feel comfortable to get involved and contribute is a really important consideration. All right, let's jump into some of the components now, and we'll work through many of the things that I'm referencing. All right, this slide is symbolic to some extent, and hopefully, I'm just going to get rid of that bar there. Hopefully, people can see what I've put up. What I like about this slide, and I don't know about all of you in the room, but it feels to me like almost every day I'm bombarded with media, news, talkback radio. I confess I occasionally listen to talkback radio. If I want to be distracted, I'm here in Melbourne and I'm a bit of a sports nut, and I listen to a sports radio station in the morning. And I was listening not that long ago, and in the course of half an hour on a sports radio station, the first four headline stories were about mental health. The discussions were about a AFL footballer who was taking a leave of absence to look after his mental health. And I won't labour the point, but every one of the stories was important, sensitively dealt with, but a reminder that no industry, no workplace is immune from needing to think about and consider what do we do? What is our role when it comes to mental health and wellbeing? And so winding our way through the masses of information, including sadly misinformation, and working out, all right, in the face of all of these numbers and all of these changes and evolutions out there in the broader community, what do we as an organisation need to pay attention to, and what is our role? So one of the really important first things, I think, for organisations and for the development and effective strategy is to really understand some of the underlying concepts. So let me share a couple with you that I hope give a bit of context and a little bit of practical, useful guidance about working out the answer to the question in plain language. What is ours to deal with and what is not? I love this simple slide. When I went to uni and did my postgraduate, I started life as a clinician, and way too long ago. And Lisa, thank you for reminding me that it is more than 40 years, which plonks me squarely back in the 70s and 80s in my training. Don't worry, I have done continuing professional development. It didn't stop then. However, I was always trained in a very black and white way about mental health. You were sane or not sane. You had depression or you didn't. And it was a very bipolar way of thinking about mental health and well-being. And aligned with that was a very strong sense that, well, for mental health to be an issue, then it means that you're mentally ill. Nothing could be further from the truth. And this picture on the screen I always find quite helpful to remind me that for most of us, our workforces, the people in our teams, indeed ourselves, we generally live on a continuum where our well-being can move and shift and fluctuate. And, you know, there are times when we might be in the green. We all aspire to live down there in the green in a state of, you know, positive, healthy functioning. And can I just, for later discussion, put in brackets, which does not necessarily mean happiness. I have made the mistake in a strategy of thinking that my staff's happiness was my responsibility. That did not go well. However, creating an environment where people can be their best selves and we can enable positive and healthy functioning, that actually is part of my responsibility. But let's be realistic that the nature of life, the exigencies of life means that all of us move up and down this strategy. So we find ourselves in the orange. You know, I'm a grandparent now of 7 and got fleets of kids hanging around. And someone said to me in my family the other day, Simon, do you know you're only ever as happy as your unhappiest child? And I thought that was a moment of wisdom that made me reflect. It's true. I can find myself a little bit in the orange when I've got family members who are struggling. Now, let's be really clear about this. If people find themselves down in the red for extended periods of time, then there are obviously risks associated with that. And indeed, that can take us into the world of dysfunction or mental illness. Now, let's just put that in context for a moment. What does that actually mean? And I think it's important to think about this because this will take us into what's our responsibility. And let me be as practical as I can here. We will employ people who bring to our workplace themselves and themselves might well carry a diagnosis of a significant mental illness. Now, there's a certain irony to that. Some of the most serious mental illnesses, if we start to talk about things like psychotic disorders or schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, things I'm sure you've all heard of at different times, they are often the most treatable and with proper medical support and treatment. There are plenty of people who carry those types of diagnoses and are able to live a useful and productive work life and contribute extremely comfortably. I had a rude awakening to that particular issue very early in my career. Some of you who've met me might know I spent some time in the police force in Victoria, and I was, amongst other things, responsible for mental health and the wellbeing of police officers and their families for 5 years some time ago. And I remember sitting in my office one day, and a experienced sergeant came into my office in uniform, firearm on, and sat down. He said, I just want to have a chat to you, Simon. I've got some issues going on, and I'm in conflict with my senior sergeant, and I just want to have a bit of it. It's getting me down a bit, and I wouldn't mind a bit of guidance about how to work through this work dispute. And then he paused for a moment, and he said to me, and I should let you know, I do wonder, Simon, whether my bipolar disorder has any relevance to this conversation. And he stopped and he looked up and he said, no, I don't think so. Don't think it's about that. I think he and I have a personality clash. So we went. We did some work. We whiteboarded and we looked at options, and we had a really good discussion about managing that conflict. When he left my office, I sprinted down the corridor, found the psychiatrist, the police psychiatrist, said, oh my God, I don't know what to do. I've just had a police officer who's told me he's got bipolar disorder, and he was carrying a gun and he was sitting in my office. And the psychiatrist thankfully sat me down and said, Simon, you need to really understand something. We have 40 operational police officers as of today who carry that diagnosis. They are part of a program that we have. They all work functionally, but they all are part of a monitoring program to ensure that medication and the like is right. And he said something else to me at that moment, which stuck with me forever. And he said, and just as a bit of a safeguard, Simon, every one of them has a nominated buddy in their work team who's aware of their circumstances and is able to check in and make sure things are going all right. And he looked at me and he said, and it works really well. And by the way, in subsequent years, that principle actually applies really well. Now, why do I say that? Well, a lot of the issues that we're actually talking about in terms of a mental health strategy are not necessarily about having to manage lots of people with very serious mental illness. I'll come back to them later because that obviously is a part of what we need to work on. But the vast majority of the issues that we're actually talking about today are related to 3 or 4 things. The growth of people's comfort in being able to talk about and share how they feel in their day-to-day life. And those feelings that we're talking about are about anxiety, depression, and I'll come back to a few other things. But essentially, most of the time, when we talk about mental health strategy and people on the mental health continuum, we're talking about issues to do with anxiety and depression. Now, there are a number of other manifestations of those things. I'm sure someone will ask a question later about things like post-traumatic stress disorder and the like. And they are really important things for us to talk about. But I think it's important to make the distinction between, what is mental illness, what is the feelings that are associated with life in general, and what is it we are trying to achieve in terms of wellbeing, particularly in terms of what we as an organisation are responsible for. Right, a very pragmatic point related to one of my dot points. An easy element of the strategy is that we should be absolutely clear about the things that we ask our people to do that foreseeably have a potential to impact their mental health and well-being. I hope that didn't sound like a too complicated sentence, but the lawyers in the room will say, yes, good, that's about foreseeable risk. So again, using maybe some examples that might resonate for people in the room, we would now say, for example, that asking people to work as a FIFO, a fly-in fly-out worker, working intensive periods of shift work, moving in and out of remote areas, we would now say, based on everything that we now know, that there would be a foreseeable risk to the mental health and well-being of those people. Give me a quick thumbs up if that makes sense. If people are going, yep, that asking people to be FIFO would carry a foreseeable risk. Great. All right. I saw a few thumbs up coming up there. Now, that means that if your organisation carries that risk and it's foreseeable, then of course we need to, in our mental health strategy, make sure that we are looking at that risk, back to one of my other points, from the perspective of how do we prevent or prepare people to face that risk? How do we manage that risk when it eventuates? In other words, when it's live and in front of us and people are doing the work and moving backwards and forwards. And then thirdly, does our strategy also help us when people are affected or they are in need of some sort of support and assistance? So your strategy around that foreseeable risk would have those three components. They might have other things, but it will at least have those things. I think another question, and probably if you're reading into my language, a focus on what is the corporate responsibility here? I do think that's a good question. And I've got two answers to that at the moment. The first one is that each organisation, I think, in its strategy has to deliberate about that issue and make decisions about what it wants to take responsibility for and what it wants to offer as part of its mental health strategy. And I'll talk a little bit more about what those things might or might not look like. But the starting point is, are we clear about what's ours and what's not? We've got some people from public transport. One of the things, and that triggered a memory for me about some fantastic work done in the railways. And let me just pull down the screen for a moment because I'd like people to hop in if they've got a question, and I'll just get the chat up as well. One of the really interesting foreseeable risks, and a tragic risk, of course, in the world of driving trains is the likelihood that at some point in your day, your week, your month, you may well be confronted by a person who takes their own life by throwing themselves in front of a train. It is a really sad but relatively frequent reality in that world. But without exception, across our public transport and our train organisations across this country, they've made enormous progress in terms of being able to think about that from a risk management perspective. And the questions that were answered in the course of managing that particular risk to our drivers and other staff was about, is there a way that we can reduce the likelihood of that event occurring? And I personally think that is a really good and important place to start many of the mental health strategy conversations. Just a side note, and I imagine this will resonate with many. I have been party to, and I'm sure I've done this myself, where in the absence of a solution to reduce or change the risk, it can often feel like to staff that the only option available to them is to toughen up. And, we can inadvertently ask people to Yes, I know you had to deal with that terrible experience, but how about we get you a counsellor, or how about we run some resilience training and the like. Now, I'm not criticising those things, but it's just a cautionary note in our strategies that being aware that balancing those back end things with some really good work on how we can reduce or mitigate the risk is a very sensible thing to do. And most of the train companies have been really good at that. They have collaboratively looked at ways to reduce the risk, to make the lines less accessible, to engineer out, if you like, some of the ways in which people get access to the train. Secondly, they've really improved many of the ways in which you can reduce the risk to the driver in the moment. Lines that automatically come down to prevent some of the visibility, and so on. You can imagine many of the initiatives that have been designed to really make sure we're reducing the extent of the exposure to that really tragic incident. And then at the back end, we've got much more sophisticated and effective in terms of, and how do we deal with our driver after the event, and what are some of the ways that we should support them in terms of recovering and the like. Does that one make sense to people? I think it's a really nice, I don't think a metaphor, but a nice example of a way in which a strategy can actually really make a difference to people's mental health and wellbeing in the workplace. And by the way, one other quick comment on that. One of the things that not just the public transport organisations have discovered there is that not all drivers, of course, react the same way to the same event. And that became particularly relevant when you start to think about what is it that supports someone. Some drivers were not impacted, not affected, and in fact often wanted to return to work very quickly. And I remember being party to a policy that said, no, if you are involved in one of these incidents, then you should have an automatic period of time off. Well, guess what happened? Subsequent evidence and research made it quite clear that sometimes the worst thing that we could do was in fact take someone out of their workplace, take them away from their colleagues, their managers, their peers, their supporters, because what do we do if we're asked to spend a couple of weeks of unscheduled time off? I think the answer is probably self-evident. And these days we would make sure that we help provide people with an opportunity to have some control over their own destiny, how they return to work, when they return to work, what type of duties they might get involved in. Generally speaking, being back involved in work is generally viewed as a protective factor. All right. Has anyone got a quick comment or a question at this stage about any of those things that I've been chatting about so far? Okay. Please don't be shy as we go. I'm really keen to hear from people's thoughts. All right. Let me share a couple of really important contextual elements. I find it very useful, and this is current and very recent data, to look at, apropos of the notion of, well, what are the actual risks that we're talking about and that are relevant in our respective workplaces. Looking at aggregated claims data is quite helpful. It's not the whole picture, and I'll explain more about that in a moment. However, when you look at the Safe Work Australia data, and I think this is good quality data, and it's drawn from a whole range of work environments, and they look at what are the claims that are based on mental health related diagnoses. These are the top 5 things as at 2024. And I'm going to spend a couple of minutes on these and maybe get some response to your own environments and your industries and how this applies. Number one, at the time of this report, was still claims related to workplace harassment and bullying. Now, this one is very tricky. And one of the reasons for the fact that I say it's tricky is that it is also one of the areas where so many organisations have put in place and done an enormous amount of work in educating and putting in place processes and practices, yet they still find that claims arise. And I can say from my own experience that there are some organisations I have worked in and with where their anti-bullying practices, their bullying and harassment processes are excellent, but there are still claims. And this is, in some respects, a wicked problem. I also think it relates to the way we collect data. There are many organisations that use standard surveys, and in that they ask questions about harassment and bullying. But interestingly, they may not ask questions about other concerns or issues that impact mental health. And just a cautionary note, if that's the only question you ask people about mental health triggers, then respondents will tick that box. So it is feasible that some of the workplace-related harassment and bullying claims arise because there are not other options for people to talk about in terms of whatever it is that's impacting their mental health. The second thing is work pressure. Now, a little more about this. The work pressure factor, and we'll talk about this when we come to psychosocial risk, is usually related to one of the following things: job demands, i.e. the actual mechanics of the role, and some form of pressure or stress associated with that. Secondly, it can be associated with workload. And I think our strategies need to pull apart the difference between those two things because they are different. Fixing one may not necessarily fix the other. The third one is exposure risk to traumatic events. And we all know, in particular, the impact of jobs and roles where we ask people to deal with or manage distressing or potentially distressing material. There are certain industries where this is more prominent. The fourth one, no surprise here, and this one is climbing, is exposure to workplace violence. Interestingly, even at Australia Post, can anyone guess, by the way, what Australia Post's number one safety issue was? Not necessarily related to mental health, just in general. Anyone want to shout that one out for me?
Dogs.
Correct. There you go. Did everyone hear that? Dogs. Dogs were our most important safety risk, closely followed by motor vehicles, in particular at roundabouts and the like. However, we also had a significant problem with workplace violence in our retail and postal networks. Now, the workplace violence thing is particularly prominent in retail, healthcare, and, no surprise, education. So depending on which industry you're from, identifying, where you sit in relation to workplace violence is critical, and it is a really tough problem, of course. Number 5 relates to other mental stress factors, which is not particularly helpful because that actually could mean a lot of things. Now, can I tell you an emerging one that I would have on this list, which is contributing to an increasing number of claims, is workplace transformation and change. Now, my view is that is quickly moving towards being a top 5 and is probably represented in this data in the other mental stress factors. So if your workplace is looking at a strategy to deal with foreseeable risks in any of these categories, that is not a bad place to start. I would imagine, even in this room today, there are some of you who are looking at that list going, all of the above. And hence my strong view that, where we should be focusing our mental health strategy is on, at least in the starting point, on the things that are absolutely critical to our workforce and unique. A couple of things here I think it's worthwhile one of the reasons I just want to share this data, not to inundate people with unnecessary stats, there is a really good business case for what we are here talking about today. Um, and I'm mindful, I read a report, a very famous report on the cost of mental health in the workplace done by one of the big consulting firms 5 or 6 years ago. And it came up with a very large number. Um, and I wasn't really sure about how we got to that number. How do you measure the economic impact? However, we all know in our businesses, and I'm acutely aware of this, absenteeism and the impact of absenteeism, of course, which flows on into extra load on other workforce members and the like, has a very clear and immediate impact on our financial performance. So when we look at mental health claims, at the moment, 9% of all serious workers' comp claims are in the mental health space, and this number is quickly growing. There's a 37% increase since 2016 to 2024, which when you put it next to all other workers' comp claims is over double. And so we've got a bit of a hockey stick curve going on. And here's the real kicker, I think, that, again, intrinsically we know. The time lost for mental health claims is on average 4 times greater than other injuries. The return to work rates are lower and slower. And the most prominent diagnoses are anxiety, depression, PTSD, or something loosely referred to as reaction to stressors, or often combination of anxiety and depression. And the median cost comp, which is a pretty compelling figure, over 50,000 compared to 15,000. Now, I don't know whether anyone out there is surprised by that, and I don't want to overemphasize it because it's a very clinical set of stats, but it does provide a business case for us to think about we should get in front of this and where we can mitigate the issues. All right, let's talk about obligations. One part of our strategy clearly needs to be cognizant and take into account the expectations of our regulatory systems and frameworks. And I think this is best thought about in terms of sort of 4, maybe 5 categories. And I'm not going to labour these, but I'll open it up if anyone's got any particular questions. And also, just as a reminder, whilst all of you are subject to state-based health and safety laws and they govern the health and safety environment, there are also more recent changes to the regulations derived from the health and safety laws that have an impact in terms of the expectations of the regulators for us to be a safe workplace. Now, I'm sure we're all aware in general terms that our obligation is to ensure a safe workplace and to make sure that we avoid discrimination. Now, in practice, it can be quite complicated to manage both the perception of and the reality of discrimination. And that could go to questions about, and let me put this quickly in a case example. I had an organisation say to me recently, we don't do light duties. We can't. We don't have anything called a light duty. Now, I can assure, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm surrounded by them, but I can assure you that argument will not float. So in terms of reasonable and practicable modifications to enable people to return to work and to rehabilitate, there is a very strong onus on organisations and employers to be able to find ways to get people back to work. And this applies as much in the mental health space as it does in traditional physical rehabilitation. So I think there's, in our strategies, the idea that, we can have very modern and contemporary return to work programs, but also ensuring that there is a philosophy in our strategy that treats mental health injury in not dissimilar ways to those we would treat physical injuries. Without overemphasising it, I always remember, again, in my police days, you can imagine policing has many predictable and foreseeable psychosocial risks. Some would say to me, yes, Simon, but many people join a police force knowing and being willing to take on those risks. And that is absolutely right. And that is a protective factor. Nonetheless, however, over lengthy periods of times, some of those risks become less manageable and people can react to those risks. And we had, back in the day, a special place called the radio repair workshops. And the radio repair workshops, I used to think, was a radio repair workshop, as you would. And one day, one of my colleagues said, Simon, you better go down and have a look at the radio repair workshops. And I went down to the Collingwood radio repair workshops and I discovered a place where, sure, there was a few radios being installed into cars and repaired, but there was a lot of operational coppers who were there having a respite from their duties on the van. They'd been temporarily transferred or they were on a return to work program, but it was a place where people were supported, cared for. The peer support in that environment was amazing. And there was a very forward-thinking senior sergeant in charge of the place who knew why people were there. And what was interesting was it was highly effective in transitioning people back to operational duties. It's a source of some sadness to me to know that that function is no longer available. That's not a criticism. I understand there are other pressures, to have a place like that. But I do want to make the point that finding ways to accommodate reasonable adjustments to roles is a pretty important part of this discussion. Naturally, privacy we're all aware of, and then avoiding adverse action. So having anything that is punitive around people who are recovering from or injured at work, from a psychological point of view, it's absolutely critical to make sure that we don't unfairly and unreasonably treat them. Now, let me say, from an optimistic point of view, I see many, many organisations who have completely embraced these principles, and there are, fortunately, more good case studies of solving for these things than the opposite in my more recent experience, which is a good thing. All right, let's dig a little deeper into how we pull all these things together and start to say, what's our mental health strategy going to look like? Hopefully you can start to see where I'm coming from in terms of point one. It's really important at the front end of developing your strategy to say, right, these are the things we must take account for. We must recognise the things that we ask of our people that might have the potential to have impact on their work. So we as an employer are going to be really clear that first and foremost, our strategy deals with the things that we ask you to do. Then secondly, you need to take a position about what is the view of the company in relation to the whole person. What do they bring to work? Because back to my earlier slide, people, interestingly enough, have lives outside of work, and they will increasingly bring to the workplace their whole self, and that will come with all of the things that we know in terms of mental health trends and the like. Another stat that one of my colleagues from Black Dog shared with me recently, and they do excellent work in understanding the state of the nations, was a reminder that as we sit here today, somewhere in the vicinity of 40% of young Australians under the age of 25 identify as having some form of mental health condition. Now, it's all very well, and again, that probably takes us into that world of social media and media where, some people agree with that, some people disagree. Some people will say they can't all have a mental health condition. Well, let's not buy into that debate because, A, we're not going to solve it. The reality is, however, that increasingly our workforces will have within them a growing number of people who talk about and see themselves as suffering from anxiety in certain circumstances, suffering from depression. If anyone watches any media outlets, you will be aware of the dramatic growth in diagnosis. And in some of the states represented in this meeting today, it is higher than others, and that is ADHD. The fourth area of significant growth is in the area, and when I say growth, the proportional rates will be about things like spectrum disorders, autism and Asperger's. I won't go into detail about those today, we haven't got time. Suffice to say that one of the issues that the NDIS is now wrestling with is, in fact, the dramatic increase in the number of Australians who have those conditions or identify as having those conditions. Now, what does that mean for a workforce? It means your strategy at some point will probably have to have something in it about neurodiversity. I didn't know what neurodiversity was until 7 or 8 years ago, and I've been a shrink all my life. And the idea of a policy or a strategy that recognises and has a position around neurodiversity is actually a really important part of it. And I'm just looking down the chat just to make sure. Oh, someone. That's all right. Nothing there for the moment. Sorry. So can I urge you to think carefully at the front end and say, right, what is ours and what do we want our strategy to address? My view, for what it's worth, is that a large chunk of the strategy will be about the things we ask our people to do, but our strategy should also address the whole person and what people bring to work. And in practical terms, does that mean that we have to provide marriage guidance counselling for everyone? Does it mean we have to provide a range of services that might actually be better provided out in the community? I think not. Now, a good EAP, of course, an employee assistance program provider, will in fact be able to accommodate, manage, respond to many of those elements that people bring to the workplace. So, a clear vision about responsibility, both corporate. I put the employee there because I think the most successful mental health strategies, in my view, really emphasise the shared responsibility point. I don't think this is controversial. I think this is simply a recognition that for mental health strategy to be effective, all parties need to do their piece. It can't be the organisation simply being in loco parentis. I care for my employees. I want to provide a safe environment, but I'm not their mum. And at the same time, I think we can enable or connect people to supports, but is it the obligation of my business to provide all of those in loco parentis services? I don't think so. But it sure as hell is if I'm asking train drivers to drive along a train line where we know there's a possibility that people will attempt suicide by train, then I need to deal with that. The integration into business as usual is a really interesting one, and I've really wrestled with this myself. And what I mean by this is that I would prefer to see a mental health strategy where the things we're talking about are embedded into business as part of the strategy in general. I think there's a risk when we hive it all off. And I'll give you one very practical personal example. I was the Chief Mental Health Officer at Australia Post. I was the first one at Australia Post, and I did that role for 2 years. Great experience. But one of the things I didn't anticipate was I would have daily conversations where well-meaning people would say, hey, Simon, I've got an employee here who's struggling a bit. And I didn't actually say this, but I would say, we've got 80,000 employees. What do you want me to do? And there was this idea that the one Chief Mental Health Officer somehow was now responsible for mental health across the organisation. And I think that actually is a risk. When you create a special small portfolio, I think that's risky. Whereas on the other hand, I think a mature strategy is going to say, we've all got a role to play in mental health, but let's make those things clear, definable, easy to access so that a local manager or a local supervisor is able to help people prevent, to manage, and to respond. So in other words, we need the system of work in place that enables a safe, mentally safe workplace environment. So I'm a fan of integrating mental health more into the sort of broader business as usual. And interestingly, for those who are curious, after I left Australia Post, that position has not been refilled. No wisecracks about why that might be the case, but I think that is possibly the right move. Next one. In your strategy, I mentioned earlier strategy alignment to capability. I think we've got to be really focused on helping those who are nearest to the people in our workplace feel confident and competent to be able to provide the support that we're talking about. Now, what does that mean? I, like many of you, I suspect, I have conversations with supervisors who privately say to me, oh my God, Simon, they expect me to be a counsellor, they expect me to be a mental health this and that. And it's scary. I don't feel like I've got those skills. Now, here's a couple of interesting observations. And in fact, I included this point in the Australia Post Mental Health Strategy. And one of the board members asked me a question. And the point I made was that I don't necessarily think that you need to train every supervisor as a mental health first aider. And the board member said, well, what is the skill set of a good supervisor to create a mentally healthy workplace? And I said, without hesitation, it is the skills of being a good supervisor. And the board member was great, because the board member asked me the next question, and he said, so you're saying that the training, the most effective training for line managers and supervisors could be something like frontline supervisor, you know, with a little bit of some mental health knowledge and confidence in. And that was spot on. Because when you think about what a good supervisor does, what does a good supervisor do? Meets regularly with their people, keeps an eye on how things are going, does good performance monitoring, review, and conversations. They are the things that are really important in terms of creating a consistent, predictable, mentally safe workplace. So I think all of our mental health strategies should have a component that talks about the right sort of knowledge and capability for the people who are going to be closest to the workforce in the areas of risk. And again, plenty of case studies where organisations are now doing that. And I can tell you that some of those supervisors are very thankful. They go through that type of training, which I'm sure many of your organisations do, and they are really thankful that the emphasis is on simply being a great supervisor, not being a counsellor. I've probably already made the point about less is more, do fewer things, but do them well. And, you know, the fads and trends, I think is self-evident. I imagine winding your way through. Again, when I took on the Australia Post job, I was amazed and inundated by pictures for people selling me, you know, everything from snake oil to vitamin supplements to a whole range of things that in the end had very little impact, relevance or evidence in relation to a positive impact on the workforce and their mental health. Now, let's just jump to the meaningful consultation and participation. I think that, you know, involving people in a number of steps in the process is critical. And one part of that is to actually use job holders and the people doing the work to identify what the risks are in their work. That is actually quite a useful thing. And I've found that the people who are most expert in the nature of their roles and where the risks lie are the job holders themselves. So one of the things in your consultation framework that I think is effective is qualifying people in that consultation process such that we're asking questions of the right people who know the roles and are able to articulate and describe those risks. No surprise, they often turn out to be the people who also have ideas about mitigation, risk removal, and the like. So I think focusing consultation in on what are the risks and what are ways to manage those risks is a pretty good starting spot. And I think one of the things I've also learned is that consultation is not about throwing it open to everyone. I had a funny experience not long ago with a head of people and culture I know well, and she rang me. I had an organisation of 3,000 people and said, "Oh, Simon, I'm sending out the wellbeing survey." So, great. Do you want any advice? She said, "No. I've got a really good survey, and it'll be fine." And I said, "Oh, just out of interest, can you describe the survey to me?" She said, "Oh, it's really easy. It's one question, and then there's space for people to write." I said, "What's the question?" And the question was, "What would you like to see in this organisation that would be beneficial for your wellbeing?" End of question. Now, you can imagine, well, if you can't imagine, let me share with you what came back, because I got a phone call a couple of weeks later, and she said to me, "Oh my God, help, Simon. I've got the survey responses back." I said, "Okay. Number one, sack my boss. Number two, more pay. Number three, more leave." You can predict, and the value of the responses, of course, was diminished because there was no structure, no, ability for people to actually talk to and manage the actual risks associated with the business. So it was a good learning, but of course is pointed towards take seriously how you identify, uncover, and then explore the particular risks in your organisation. And I think building in an independent review process is worthwhile. I think, and the review processes really are about ensuring governance, ensuring that what we put in place is having the desired impact, and being what's the word I'm looking for? Being fairly unemotional, if you like, about when things are not working. If we try things but we don't see any value, then being quick to respond to that and divert your interventions or preventative measures elsewhere is a really, really good thing to do. So let me jump into a model that I would like to share, and just here we go. All right. So if we use that little framework that I was talking about before, prevent, manage, and then respond, what are some of the things that we're likely to see in a good strategy? So a couple of dot points in there that I haven't mentioned already that I just want to draw people's attention to. Clearly, there is value at the preventative side of things of not only identifying where jobs carry risk, but focusing a fair bit of work on, whether or not you can change the structure and nature of a particular role so that you mitigate the risk. Now, this is not always obvious, but I've seen many very creative examples of how this can operate. I was talking to a leadership team yesterday, and one of them reminded me of what prima facie looked like a very mundane example of this, but was enormously impactful. Let me give it to you in a very quick summary. It was inside a large industry superannuation fund. And in the team that handled death benefits and the release of superannuation funds in the event of the death of a member, they had a particular problem. And the problem was this, that to release the funds, the fund required the death to be registered with births, deaths and marriages. That sometimes took between 6 and 12 months. Does anyone want to guess what happened to that team while the families and the beneficiaries were waiting? The phone calls, sadly, the sometimes aggressive or abusive behaviour that was way beyond the control of the small team that managed it. They had turnover, they had claims, they had all sorts of workers' comp problems. And on questioning and an examination, one of the young staff said, "Well, I'm glad you've asked me what I would do about this." And she said, "Did you know that we get the GP's death certificate within 24 hours of the death, whereas it can take 6 to 12 months for the death to be registered?" And I was listening to this thinking, that's really interesting. And she piped up and said, "And in my whole 4 years working in this space, if a GP says Johnny's dead, he's never turned out not to be dead." They were able to adjust the policy, the process, piece of work in a way that changed the time frame and removed completely what had previously been viewed as a psychosocial risk that had the regulator all over it, gone. Now, I only offer that as I don't want this to, when I talk about engineering at risk, sometimes it can be a process piece of work that we're able to look at and go, actually, we could do that differently. So the work and task redesign piece feels to me almost like it's gone full circle. It's back to that discipline of saying, do we really understand all the tasks and the elements of a role, particularly the ones that carry some sort of risk? Another quick example was in the court system, you would all have seen either in television or through your own court appearances. Just pause there. Court reporters, people who sit in court and write everything down when a trial or a hearing is being done. I wonder whether we ever sat there and thought, gee, what are we asking those people to listen to, watch and observe? No surprise, high claim rates, high stress rates. Interestingly, what they discovered, if you remove court reporters from the court, put them in a remote location, let them work with headphones, let them work on shorter shifts, let them tap out if they were dealing with something particularly stressful, all of the elements of exposure reduced. I would argue, by the way, one of the critical features in the success of that re-engineering or redesign was that the staff had control over their ability to manage their risk profile. In the management space, we've talked about that. Good strategy will have capability, leadership, confidence. It will have a structure and a process, a system of work that enables people to feel like when risks happen, my team, my boss, my workplace manages that really well. And I think, for example, just to go back to the public transport, that's certainly the sense that I hear when I hear drivers, for example, talking about the mechanisms that are in place. And by the way, we shouldn't underestimate, if your staff are saying, actually, you know what, there is risk, but our company, our organisation manages it well, then that is usually a preventative factor. And lastly, having in place the supports, the safety nets, the response mechanisms that are necessary when people are exposed, when people are in a situation where maybe they are impacted or affected in some way by whatever the set of circumstances might be. And by the way, in this last one, the safety net, I don't think you need to make a distinction between whether someone's distress is work-related or not work-related. This is the nexus, the point where actually as a manager or leader, someone's distressed, then we have things in place. I don't need to know at that moment or qualify them because it's work-related or not work-related. Doesn't matter. So having the safety nets in place, whether that's EAP, whether it's a peer support program, whether it's great supervisors who in many cases head off and are able to manage distress in their teams, I think that is a really important part of the process. All right, time's flying. I'm just going to pull the slide down for a moment, and I'd love to get a question, a comment, or if anyone wants to offer an example or a good or a bad of any of the things that we've been talking about so far. Jump in.
Yeah, Simon, g'day. My name's Ben. Thanks for the session today. It's been fantastic. Couple of things that sort of pricked my ears up a little bit when we talked about emerging risks
Yep.
and being drivers around, I guess, mental health is workplace transformation and change. I think that's something
Yep.
that gets underestimated at times. So it was
Agreed.
interesting to hear you talk about that. And then the other thing that, thinking about people bringing their whole selves to work. We say that, but then we also say that we want you to do that within our values of our business. And then some people can't differentiate between, oh, you said I could bring my whole self, but now you're telling me that I can't do what I would normally do to bring my whole self in. So it's just being super clear on what that is and how we can make people feel comfortable at work, and still be themselves. But yeah.
Ben, that is such a good observation. I think we're in an interesting moment in time at the moment where the pendulum has swung. I've got close colleagues at Beyond Blue, and I often say to them, did you ever anticipate how much you have fixed the stigma issue? So much of now what we talk about in the workplace is a very free and open conversation. And that in turn carries some risks. No doubt in our workforces, there are plenty of people who say, I don't want to hear all about your whole self, right? I don't need to hear it. So I think there's a little bit of balancing going on at the moment. So I think that's yet to settle. But I love your point about doing it within the values, and I think it's a good mechanism to help bring values to life. What is respectful when it comes to talking about mental health? Because most of you have probably got respect as one of your corporate values, right?
Yeah.
So I think that creates a really good conversation about what is respectful dialogue, discussion. And that probably, fair to say, Ben, is a dotted line back to my point about political constraints. I'm working in workplaces at the moment that are feeling unsafe because people, leaders, professionals feel unable to talk about some of these issues for fear of being, to be blunt, cancelled. And
Yeah.
that's not helpful. That is not helpful.
Yeah.
Thanks,
And
Ben. Great comment.
Yeah, I just guess to build on that, I'm in mining, and we do get that a lot from the supervisors that some people are scared to, or worried, not scared, worried about holding people accountable for their behaviour,
Yep.
just due to the concern that it'll turn someone into having a mental health issue, and then not being able to deal with it. So, yeah.
I think that would be close to my number one issue in the supervisor training, to be quite practical. I would say that concern that people have about performance management and a performance culture alongside mental health is where it's got a bit skewed, right? Because legislatively and from a regulator point of view, I can have anxiety, I can be depressed, but I still need to do my job. And, helping people navigate that new grey area is a really useful thing to do.
Yeah.
Thanks,
Agreed.
Ben.
Thanks.
So, by the way, I would have that in my strategy. And indeed, at Australia Post, we had that in our strategy, helping build capability around performance management for line managers so they could handle exactly that issue you were describing. Someone else has anyone got their hand up or want to comment?
I think on that note, it's a good opportunity to say a very, very big thank you, Simon. You definitely delivered on how the scene was set with what a thought-provoking, deep, in tune conversation and some things for people to really take away. And I think we could spend hours with you. I've always thought we should be creating a whole workshop with you at Mainstream, because there's so much to work through. And this was just a slice. But we are very excited to have you at Mainstream and to see you in person. I mean, it's just another added layer of enjoyment. But again, thank you so much, Simon. You're an amazing presenter, educator, thought leader, and doing great work. So keep it up. And again,
It's very kind. And can I just say to everyone in this meeting, if you want to reach out, I'm easy to find. I'm always happy to have a chat. I'm luckily at a stage in my career and my life, I've got a little more flexibility these days. As long as it doesn't interfere with the grandkids, I'm all good.
Your priority. So yes, that's great, Simon. And also, Steph in the chat's going to put a link to join the mentoring community if you aren't already, which gives you access to these monthly masterclasses. It's all complimentary, podcasts, white papers, staying connected with each other. So there it is, very easy to join. A couple of buttons, and then you're in, and you've got access to a lot of amazing, like-minded people like you. And so on that note, to those who are coming to mentoring, we look forward to seeing you there. You can see types of speakers like this we go for their 130 sessions, ranging from people, process, strategy, technology. And Simon, we're so excited that you're having us to mark our 30th year. Really, really special to have you. To everyone here, thank you for joining. I can see Anthony there is presenting as well. The good old reliable Anthony. I know Martin's coming as well. I can see it's been wonderful to see you. Well, I see some of the faces, but know that the one that you hear. And, I wish you well in taking back what you've taken away today, and with your own well-being at the heart of everything. We get to support each other, and that's what it's really, really about in today's world, really here for each other. So we'll be seeing you soon, and thank you, everybody. Have a wonderful afternoon, and special having you part of this mentoring community. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you, everyone. Thanks, Lisa.